if you don't already. So we're going to be hearing first from Jirka Lithgaard, who is the Senior Chemicals Advisor at ChemSec. He's the team leader for ChemSec's internal chemicals team and responsible for contacts with national authorities and chemicals policy related issues. He was in charge of the development and dissemination of the SIN list, which is something that we have used in the past, and I really recommend you get to know. And I think, in fact, you're going to hear a lot about different tools that will be really useful for you. We're then going to be hearing from Patrick Witowski, who's the Sustainable Finance Advisor at ChemSec. So he is supporting institutional investors in their engagement with the world's largest chemical companies. And prior to that, Patrick made documentary films and promoted employee ownership. So really interesting background. And Patrick and Jirka, we're very happy to have you both join us. I'd like to also introduce you all to Yelena Buha, who joined Zurich Insurance Group in early 2015 as a risk engineer. Currently, she's the global practice leader in liability risk engineering and is a subject matter expert for the chemical, pharmaceutical, and food industry. Yelena is also monitoring developments regarding global risks that have an impact on Zurich, such as nanotechnology, chemicals with human or environmental hazard potential, gene editing technologies, microplastics, and sustainability-related topics. Yelena is involved in internal and external projects for casualty CAT modeling and is representing Zurich in the Emerging Risks Group of the Swiss Insurance Association. So I want to, again, welcome you all for joining us. We're really very pleased to have you here, and I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to you, Jirka. And while we get him set up, if you all wouldn't mind just sharing who you are and who you are with in the chat so that we know, so that our speakers know who's here. And Jirka, I think what I'll also do before you dive right in is I'm going to go ahead and share a quick poll. And this is a poll that might be useful for particularly Patrick's work. So let me see, I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. And it's a very quick question. So if you could all just go ahead and answer that. Is your company publicly traded? So I'm going to give it another couple of seconds here. If you haven't done so, please answer. Okay. So I'm going to share the results just so that you all can see. And it looks like about 11 of the folks who are joining us today are part of a publicly traded company, and the majority are not or are not sure. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that. Just a little good information for our speakers. All right, Jirka, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Pam. I'm very glad that you invited us to present here about ChemSec and the ChemScore and the IIHC. It's something we've been working on for several years, and we are just published last week the fourth iteration of ChemScore. And the IIHC, Patrick will talk a little bit more about. But I will start by explaining who ChemSec is, if the screen sharing will start working. And close that window. The poll was all over the place for me. So ChemSec is an environmental NGO, and we are trying to reduce the use of hazardous substances. That is kind of the baseline for ChemSec. But we're a bit different from other NGOs because we are not normally seeking confrontation with companies, but we are very hard on hazardous chemicals, but we try to cooperate as much as possible with different companies and different stakeholders. And we're really trying to drive the change to safer chemistry. So removing hazardous chemicals and instead replace them with safer alternatives. We are financially independent of the companies we're working with and also the investors. So we don't have any financial ties and no financial dependency on the companies we're cooperating with, because we have a core financing from the Swedish government and also from different charity funds, which are providing us with the necessary means to do our work. So what we're doing, we have 4 main areas, you could say. We're trying to push the political discussions, mostly in the EU, but also partly in other parts of the world, but we're very EU-centered in the policy discussions. But also when it comes to companies, they are definitely global. So they were really trying to push global companies to improve chemicals management and their internal processes and to become better. But we're also solution providers. We're not just looking for to bashing, but also want to show this is the next step you can do. This is the way you can identify hazardous chemicals and so on. And we do this by developing different tools, online tools to help companies to switch to safer alternatives and identify the hazardous chemicals. And the 4th thing we're doing, that is inform investors, because investors has often been foreseen by NGOs to a very large extent. And we have trying to explain to them the need to integrate chemicals management and the production of hazardous chemicals and the safer alternatives in their assessment. So, because there's a large opportunity, but also a large risk connected to chemical companies and the use and production of hazardous chemicals. We have a number of different tools, just to highlight a few ones. The SINLES, for example, which identify very hazardous chemicals. We have the PFAS guide to help downstream users and retailers and brands to identify PFAS in their products and help to phase them out. Marketplace, which is our tool to show there are safer alternatives available. And then the 4th tool, which is ChemScore, which is a ranking of the 50 largest chemical producers worldwide. But we also engage in different initiatives, the IIHC, which Patrick will talk more about. And we have, for example, also a ChemSec business group, which is a number of big global companies where we try to talk to them and encourage them to and cooperate with them to push them to improve their chemicals management. One might then wonder, what does a toys manufacturer have in common with electronics manufacturer or furniture? But if you look at the item as such, they don't really have much in common. However, when you're looking at the supply chain communication, and the issue of hazardous chemicals, how it's being communicated in the supply chain, this is the common denominator for all these companies. They're all having the same problem to identify and phase out hazardous chemicals. So these are the ones that we have a closer relationship with in the ChemSec business group. So that's very brief about ChemSec, and I'll dive into ChemScore. As mentioned, this is the 4th iteration of ChemScore. So ChemScore tries to identify hazardous chemicals, or more correctly, the chemical producers, to identify what they are doing from 4 different angles, and all related to hazardous chemicals and the chemical production. So we're looking at their existing hazardous chemicals portfolio. We're looking at what kind of safer alternatives are they developing. We're looking at the management and transparency. What are the management ambitions to change and to become more circular, for example? And transparency, which is one very, very important issue from our point of view, is that it's visible what is being produced and which hazardous chemicals are being produced and how do you replace them with safer alternatives. And the fourth point of view that we're diving into in ChemScore is a lack of controversies. You can see that as a control station, more or less, to see if are the companies walking their talk. Because, for example, you can have very nice management documents, but if they are not adhered to, that will definitely result in accidents, spills, fines, and all kinds of problems arising at the later stage. What is really important to take into consideration here is that we only look at public available information. So, for example, if a company want to disclose something, but we are doing this or we are not doing that under confidentiality claims, we cannot take that into consideration. Anyone should be able to reiterate our assessment of every company. Of course, we see we have a weighting between these four different areas, where we find the most important one is the hazardous product portfolio. What are these chemical companies actually producing and using? So we have a weight of 18 points in total for the category 1. So if you are completely transparent with what you produce worldwide, and you don't have any hazardous chemicals according to the ChemScore, then you can receive a maximum 18 points in this category. Development of safer products and safer alternatives, that is valued as 12 points maximum. The management transparency, 12 points as well. And the lack of controversies, the control station, is 6 points. So all in all, you have a maximum score of 48 points. And what is important to keep in mind here that ChemScore doesn't want to duplicate or do something which other sustainability rankings are doing already, because we want to fill the gap in the current ESG ratings. And because none of them really take into consideration the intrinsic properties of chemicals. So a chemical company could have a very nice ranking when it comes to climate or and human rights and so on. But the core business of a chemical company is to produce chemicals. So if they're producing very toxic chemicals, that is not being picked up by other rankings. So this is the aim that we're trying to, and the gap we're trying to fill with the ChemScore. If you're interested in the full methodology, it's of course available online on chemscore.chemsec.org. You have the full methodology, you have all the 50 companies in a very thorough assessment on a number of different criteria. So we're looking at more or less 20 different criteria, which are grouped in these 4 categories from 4 different points of view. So talking about hazardous product portfolio, what are the kind of substances we include there? Of course, we're looking at the EU substances of very high concern, SVHCs. That is kind of the core that we're including. But we're also looking at global conventions like the Stockholm Convention with POPs, the waste regulation with PIC, and also highly hazardous pesticides. There's also something which is included. And new for this year, it's the PFAS. We have added a number.
Oops, Jurker, are you still there?
And also included in ChemSec. And yes.
Okay, good.
Oh, am I breaking up again?
Just a little bit. You're all better now. Thank you.
Okay. So the aim with this is to highlight the regulatory risk and also to highlight the risk of future litigation. So the financial risk to investors with ChemScore. So because if you're looking at the regulatory risk, it's a loss of market due to substance bans and other regulatory means by regulation, more or less banning substances from the market, which means a lost market for the producer. But also, when looking at future litigations, that is a potentially huge risk, especially when it comes to persistent chemicals like PFAS. So the future litigation stemming from hazardous properties of the products you're producing. And then the PFAS. We added around 400 PFAS substances to the SIN list 1 year ago, and this is resulting in an addition of a number of new companies to ChemScore as well. But looking at how it plays out in numbers, so for example, these are the top producers of PFAS substances in ChemScore. So we have ChemHours with 63 PFAS substances, which is a very, very high numbers. If you compare to the rest one, is ChemHours, 3M, and Solvay, which really stand out as huge PFAS producers. But one should take into consideration, out of the 50, we know that 25 of these companies are producing at least one PFAS substance. So it's a generic problem in the whole business. So when you're looking into how does it play out, here you have all the 50 companies. You can see if they have increased points, so if they have improved since last year, if there's been no change, or decrease in points. And also the 4 new companies are here highlighted with the purple dots. So we can see the general trend is that we're improving or steady state with regard to the points, with a few companies decreasing in the points. And then the top scorers this year, for the first time, we had Sabic as number 1. So under 4 years, we have had 3 different companies that have been the top scorer in ChemScore. So we have Sabic going up to a first place, Indorama dropping 1 rank, and Yara staying at the 3rd place this year. In the bottom, we have DuPont, we have Sumitomo, and we have ChemHours. And I will say that the DuPont, the reason for DuPont really being in the very rock bottom here, with an F, is that they are the only company which actively is trying to hide their product portfolio in the US. It's not been possible to do this in the EU, but in the US they have hidden their complete product portfolio. So that makes them impossible to rank from a transparency point of view. And then looking at how does all the points, all the companies look like when it going from year to year. So we can see you can see in this graph how it's been changing. And then what is quite interesting to look at region. So when looking at the region, for example, the Americas, all the companies in the North and South America are pretty spread out. So there's no real trend here with where they belong. On the other hand, we look at Asia, most of them belong to the bottom part of the scoring, with the exception of 2 companies, number 1 and number 2. So it's Sabic from Saudi Arabia and Indorama from Thailand. And then we have Europe. They, on their end, most of them belong to the top part, with only one exception of Unicor, which is to the bottom half of ChemScore ranking. So we can see it's how the companies are shown and how they play out per region, which is quite interesting. So I would say from the key results in this year's ranking is the transparency part. Because, for example, Sabic, they have shown their full product portfolio, and so has Eastman and Lanxess, and they don't produce any additional substance of very high concern outside the EU and US. And Braskem, they have a very interesting something called a valuation book, which is quite interesting for investors, but it also shows exactly what they're producing, at what tonnages, and what the revenue connected to both hazardous chemicals and other parts of the portfolio. Sorry, and also Arkema, which has a reporting on a global scale, all the substances of very high concern they have in numbers. And then, as mentioned, the most opaque company, which is DuPont, which is also resulting in a F grade, just like last year. And with this very brief overview of ChemScore, I'm happy to leave over to Patrick. And again, if you're interested in specific details of the methodology or specific companies, please go to ChemScore website and you'll find all the information there. Thank you.
Jerker, just one quick question before we move on. Just wanted to confirm. So ChemSec is assessing companies every year based, through the ChemScore.
Yes, it's 50 companies that were the 50 largest chemical producers we're looking at. Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And the latest results came out just 2 weeks ago. All right, thanks Jerker, thanks Pam and Liz for inviting us to Zurich to present our work. Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm Patrik Witkowski, and I thought I'd spend some time talking here about this initiative that Jerker mentioned, the IIHC. So this stands for the Investor Initiative on Hazardous Chemicals. And this is a investor initiative that by now gathers more than 50 investors with over $10 trillion of assets under management or advice. And these are really some of the largest asset managers in the world. And here are some of them on this picture. And we can take the next slide. So the IIHC, this is a group of investors that have three key asks, basically. And the asks are directed primarily towards the companies in ChemScore, so the largest publicly traded chemical companies in the world. And these three key asks are the ones you see here. So the first one is to increase transparency, and the ask more specifically is to disclose both the share of revenue and production volume of products that are or contain hazardous chemicals. The second key ask is to publish a time-bound phase-out plan of products that are or contain persistent chemicals. And this phase-out should include a realistic roadmap with clear KPIs to track progress. And why the investors have chosen persistent chemicals, I'll come back to in a second. And then the third here is to develop safer alternatives for hazardous chemicals. So to substantially ramp up R&D and investment in the development of safer alternatives. And we can take the next slide. So here are all the 50 companies that are ranked in ChemScore. So they're the ones that Jerker was talking about, our ranking. And all of these have received a letter that was sent on the 15th of November this year, stating the key asks. And if we take the next slide, here you can see that for 20 of these companies, the investors are part of groups where they engage directly with 20 of these companies that have been, so they've been selected by the investors for various reasons, because they see a particularly big risk or a big opportunity, or because they have a big holding in the company. And they engage in groups with, 7 or 8 investors in each, and have continuous calls with the companies about these asks. And what we do at ChemSec, because obviously, people working most asset managers don't have, chemists working there that can go into the nitty-gritty of complex chemical topics. So what we provide at ChemSec is, expertise and support. So that's our role in this initiative. And we can take the next slide. So there's been quite some media attention around this initiative, at least in the business press. So on the top right there in the Financial Times, this is an article from I think 2 weeks ago, and this is just to show that it's kind of there's a big interest in this topic, and especially I think from media, it's interesting that these large institutional investors raise their voices and concerns about this issue. And we can take the next slide. Right, so you know, why do institutional investors care about chemicals? And I think you'll get different replies depending on who you ask. I think this is the best way, as at least I see it. And I think the first and most just you know, straightforward answer is company-specific risks. So there are, it's becoming clear that there are, you know, there is a regulatory tightening going on around the world, and obviously, if you're an investor in companies that rely heavily on certain chemicals that might become restricted, or you know, that you can't export or whatever, that might hurt the company. So there's a big regulatory risk. There's a big legal risk due to you know, primarily in the US with the lawsuits around PFAS, but there are also reputational risk and you know, market risk, that customers are demanding completely different types of chemicals, and that you know, companies that are not moving ahead and developing safe alternatives will be sort of stuck in the past. So those are when it's like just a clear company-specific risk, but there are also more sort of systemic, or what's sometimes called portfolio level risks, and this is particularly a concern for, you know, these large, super large institutional investors that are sometimes called universal owners. You know, so the largest institutional investors in the world, you know, they own maybe 1% or 2% of the global stock market. They own every single asset class out there. So if you have one set of companies that are creating, you know, large problems, you know, it could be drive, biodiversity loss, or a lot of human health, causing a lot of human health problems, or even these sort of very large remediation costs linked to contamination from PFAS that ultimately, you know, someone will have to pay for. These are not in the interest of large institutional investors that want a stable economy from which they can generate long-term value. So for them, they have a kind of direct incentive to engage on topics that are causing problems throughout the economy, or systemic problems. And then the third, I don't know if this is the correct term, but you know, I think it's also kind of a marketing strategy that asset managers, you know, there are also companies that are trying to you know, they offer various services to clients, to the asset owners. And one of these services is sustainability services. So they want to also show that they take care of their clients' money in a responsible manner. And around the world, in the same way as, you know, producing companies are more and more subjected to various reporting requirements, so are also asset managers. So they also need to show, you know, what are you doing to address, you know, these kinds of risks, various kinds of risks. So that's also one reason why it's important for them to engage on various, like, environmental topics and human health topics. And we can take the next slide. So So some have drawn parallels between PFAS and asbestos, and I think in the sort of sustainable finance community, some are seeing especially PFAS as an ESG issue, with the potentially biggest material impact or financial impact in the next few years. And this is largely because of these major lawsuits that are taking place in the US. So in the letter that the investors in the IIHC wrote to the chemical companies 2 weeks ago, they wrote, so this is a quote, manufacturers and users of PFAS are exposed to deep liability and insurance risks reminiscent of those historically linked to asbestos. And this could materially adversely harm the long-term value of companies involved in their manufacture and sale. And we can take the next slide. So this is just to give you an example. So 3M, a US chemical company, they recently, in June this year, agreed to pay up to $12.5 billion to settle hundreds of lawsuits brought by US public water systems for PFAS contamination in the United States. And as you can see here in this graph that I just pulled out, these major lawsuits that have come, that have hit 3M in the last couple of years, has been really damaging to its stock price. So 3M here is the, I'm a bit colorblind between green and blue, but the green-blue line is 3M's stock price, and you can compare that to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And this is the nightmare for an asset manager that is sitting all day and trying to figure out what stocks to buy or not. And there's even, there are all these fantasy numbers thrown out there about the potential liability costs for various companies. But one financial research firm, they estimate that 3M may face cleanup costs up to $140 billion, and that's as I understand it, only in the US. So that's more than twice their market cap, what the whole company is worth. So it's this is why there's a clear link between the production of, this is a good example of how it can be a clear link between the production and use of hazardous chemicals and stock price, which is ultimately what investors care about. We can take the next slide. Yeah, so just some key info here. So the IIHC, it's an investor-led initiative. So it's not, it's not an NGO or ChemSec led initiative. We help to coordinate the initiative and we support with expertise, but it's ultimately the investors that lead this initiative and have the calls with the companies. And we also provide educational webinars, and we're in it for the long haul. So this was launched just in January this year, and we have continuous what we call call seasons, where the investors have calls with the companies. So hopefully this will go on for a long time, because we understand that this is not something that change doesn't take place overnight when we're talking about these kinds of companies and the size of them. And we can take the next slide if there is any. And that's how you can stay in touch with us at ChemSec. So that's it for me. Thanks. Pam, do you want to say anything, or should we hand it over to Jelena? Is anyone hearing what what I'm saying?
Yeah, Pam, you're
I'm hearing.
muted.
For how long have I been talking for myself?
I think Pam is still muted.
Okay. I thought she would be presenting the slides I was supposed to show. But
Okay, let me, this is Liz, let me hop in here. Yeah, you always get problems just at the last minute, but I think I have them, so. All right, let me share screen. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks, Liz. So I was asked by Patrick here to join as we are Zurich Insurance Company is one of the investors in the initiative he was explaining before. And I thought before I explain why Zurich is interested in such initiatives, I wanted to take one step back and explain what all Zurich does in the world of sustainability, and with that hazardous chemicals included. So we are all aware of European Union Green Deal that calls for net zero green gas emissions by 2050. And we all know how this will affect businesses across the board. However, of course, it will have a tremendous impact on Europe's chemical industry as well, because it, of course, as always, it brings significant challenges, but it also brings huge opportunities for companies. That's how we like to see it in a more optimistic way. So getting there will be expensive, obviously, because the industry will need to change traditional production processes and adapt new technologies. And some of those technologies and new processes are actually into development only. I've read an article few days ago, which says that in order to achieve that 2050 Green Deal, there will have to be 1 trillion euros invested in chemical industry so that it all fits the goals. Of course, these are rough estimates only, but there will be a substantial funding gap compared to the current capital spending and increasing investments by more than 12 billion a year over the next 3 decades. Now, I'm well aware from the chat here that we do not have only chemical industry representatives here. Apologies if I have a focus on chemicals here, just given the part that was covered by ChemSec before. But we are also aware that there are actually only 8 chemicals that they are driving 75% of industry emissions. And this is ammonia, ethylene, propylene, nitric acid, carbon black, but also fluorochemicals that Patrick has passionately talked about before, like PFAS. So we are of the opinion that chemical industry can play a critical enabling role in the success of the whole deal. And we want to support there. We want to be there for them for the more sustainable future. And as chemical companies are reshaping and achieving that goal. Now, you might ask, why are we interested? We have our own commitments, being a most sustainable insurer through 3 pillars you see on the slides. So it's investment, operations, and insurance value chain. And as we all know, there will be other options going forward, such as permanently removed or permanent carbon removal credit. But we are taking our action seriously already. So I will start with the middle one, which is own operations, net zero by 2030. We're looking at 100% renewable power already achieved and 100% electrical vehicles by 2029. This is going to be key on how we reach our objectives. Then it's about investment, and that's the important part for the companies. We want to have net zero investment portfolio by 2050. As part of our commitment, we are investing in transition supporting technologies that I've talked about shortly before, and of course, green bonds. Different types of companies and organizations that are actually willing to adapt and use this sustainable approach. And last but not any less important is insurance value chain. So we want to commit with how are we going to develop our strategy and underwriting decisions in order to support companies in this transition phase, and how we can make sustainable solutions that support this commitment along with our core business, which is, of course, underwriting, and then, of course, claims, because once it comes to lawsuits, Our claims department is responsible for paying out those claims, and then risk engineering, which I'm presenting here, and that's actually the risk assessment piece of it all. So I would like you to move to the next slide, if you don't mind, Liz. So we need to first challenge and then support our customers. That means that we are committed to challenging and supporting customers so that they can transform their organization and make themselves more sustainable. We want to support and challenge our customers to build confidence, to double check, for example, force commitments, to really analyze how they are going to be impacted, how do they further build resilience being impacted by those new regulations, for example. We are doing our best to be engaged, to assist with our propositions and adapt them accordingly as well. So now you might ask yourselves how. We are actually supporting by positive actions, by developing underwriting and product solutions. But at the same time, we want to be acting with caution because rapid changes bring mindset change and mainly because of limited data. We want to be comfortable with the limited amount of data that we are getting from our customers. That means we need increased access to the information and deeper customer engagement ahead of the renewal season, for example. We want to engage early on, and we want and need to understand more when customer is showing higher level of transparency, and we want to understand how and what are they going to do. And that's why we are part of what Patrick has talked about, which is this investor organization, because the level of transparency we are getting with customer is really on a high level there in this transitioning of hazardous chemicals. We also know that we are not the only sustainable insurance company, and that there are pricing and terms and condition pressures. And we are of the opinion that the data that our customers are sharing with us can and will have impact on risk assessment procedures and on the pricing models we utilize and adapt. So we want to be careful about how, we want to be convinced, and we don't want to rush doing something before we are convinced that it's the right thing to be done. So what about, for example, sourcing of raw materials? Is it aligned with the human rights? Is it aligned with our environmental positions and all the green bonds I have mentioned? So we will keep on challenging, building this confidence piece. We want that the proper workforce commitment is there, and we want to see the change in the way that the organizations are being driven. And that will, of course, have an influence on how are we analyzing and how this impacts the risk, because that then projects to the price, of course. So we want to engage and to challenge, for example, chemical companies here to change and have less toxic chemicals, for example. And if they're on the transition way already, we want to support them in the transition way. That's how Zurich goes around these topics. So I have one more only slide to share, being conscious of time. And just to give you kind of a sneak peek on how do we do it. So we do it very similarly to what ChemSec is doing, of course, in a bit less sophisticated way, because we do not have that many chemists like myself in the organization, but we are monitoring, we're using all possible external information we can gather so that we can monitor risk. And we want to monitor those risks that are getting the attention of science. So we are monitoring science risks, but we also are monitoring legal and regulatory community risks as well. We want to be aware of if there are lawsuits being filed, like those that Patrick was mentioning around PFAS or anything else. So that includes emerging risk prioritization process. And that question that was already mentioned, what will be the next asbestos? So for us, it's not only about chemicals, as you can imagine. For us, topics are as wide as pandemics, as wide as opioids, cannabis, sport-related injuries even, but then chemically related ones like microplastics, like plasticizers, like pesticides and PFAS. But we also do want to monitor social inflation, for example, and collective redress, for example, that is happening in Europe currently. So that all is being fed to emerging risk radar and emerging risk group that we have within our organization, and that help us profiling for the casualty cat modeling and internal model that we have developed. So as you would do it for natural catastrophes, we are doing it for the casualty catastrophes, and that's where the name comes from. So of course, we don't have much time here to go into detail, but what we do after collecting all that valuable information is we want to develop insights, trainings, webinars, papers internally for the global underwriting group, so that they can really refine the appetite, they can adapt the guidelines, and last but not least, adapt or even develop new products and services. And in that process, it is very important to estimate expected loss or potential litigation environment warrants actions. This is really important for the insurance industry. So you saw most of the feed for our assessment processes as well. All those valuation books that some companies produce, the global substances of very high concern chemicals, phasing out plans, talking about safer alternatives, about sustainability reporting, which is sometimes also related to greenwashing lately, systemic risk, regulatory risk, and then last but not least, reputational risk that comes along, not only for our customers, but also for us as a company. So I guess with that, I can close here and we can move to the next part of our agenda for today. Thank you, Pam.
Yelena, thank you so much. And thank you also, Jirka and Patrick. Really, really interesting insight into how both investors and insurance companies think about the risks associated with a company's use of hazardous chemicals. What I'd like to do now is to send you off into breakout rooms to have a discussion. I just posted a PDF with the discussion questions there for you. Basically, what I want folks to talk about is how well your companies are aligned with the 3 asks that Patrick was sharing with us for the IIHC. Transparency, phasing out persistent chemicals, and developing safer alternatives. Also, if you could think about and discuss how you might use what you've heard today to help you make the business case for implementation of toxic use reduction. That's really sort of the reason for learning more about this, is so that we can have a better understanding of the costs associated with using a toxic chemical and an impact on your ability to get investors to pay attention or to be considered favorably by the insurance industry is certainly a part of that, and something that we've, I think, struggled to really have a good handle on how to quantify that. And then finally, just if within your groups you can think of 1 or 2 questions that you may want to have the larger group discussion cover, that would be great. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms. Each of our speakers are going to be available to join 1 or 2 of the rooms. And I will also post the questions on chat in case you haven't been able to access the questions document. So go ahead and join the discussions. Okay, Liz, you want to go ahead and take it from here?
Yep. And so I will moderate, and Stephen, if you could kind of watch the chat and weigh in with if people have questions or things they're contributing.
Will do.
So I'm gonna kick it off by something that our group talked a lot about, which is questions about how this impacts down the supply chain and what kinds of support the folks that are down the supply chain are getting from the larger publicly traded companies who might feel this is a priority. Did anyone else have those kinds of discussions? And you can go ahead and unmute yourself or raise your hand. What have we got?
our group talked a little bit more about how to get, or the interaction between your investors and your C-suite folks and kind of that user level, and, how sometimes in Tura, when we are having these conversations, it seems to get lost, our recommendations or, hey, have we, this is the information on evaluating alternatives or safer, processes. It sometimes seems to get lost. And, versus if you have a company that really is from the top down or at all different levels, really supporting that type of push, just kind of the difference and shared experiences at all those different levels of operation.
Yeah. So any of our distinguished speakers and guests have anything to offer about what she just shared or about the supply chain issue? You want me to go first? So you'll have to unmute yourselves.
I'm not sure I really caught the question.
Well, let's start with the question about the supply chain and how do these companies that are kind of way down the supply chain, how do they make the case to their management if we noticed that one of the things that the investors are asked to do doesn't necessarily include making sure that the companies down the supply chain are being given the resources and the information to help, the product in the end.
Right. Yeah. I think one thing that we, I think this resembles a bit the discussions that we're having with our business group that Jerker mentioned earlier, which are, of course, large consumer companies. But I think we have a bit of a different perspective. So the investors, they want to come in and see how the companies as a whole, what they are producing, the risks, and get kind of an overview of the company as a whole, which, is not usually something that's super interesting, perhaps for someone down the supply chain. They want to know what's in the products. So there are pressures on more transparency from two different points of view, but it differs a little bit. So I don't know. I think somehow it would be good to to sandwich this a little bit and coordinate the pressure. But I don't know. I don't have a better answer to it than that. I don't know if Jerker can. Yeah.
I can try to chip in a bit because when it comes to supply chain, you have, as you like, the sandwich or hamburger, they get squeezed in the middle. Because, for example, the chemical producers, they are pressured from the investor side. But then if you're going from the other side, if you're looking at consumers, and then consumers, you go into retailers, brands, downstream users, and so on. And from the consumer side, there is quite a large push as well to get safer chemistry. So you have the push from the consumer side and from the customer side, and you have the pressure from the investor side. And they work, of course, they work together. And this is this double way of pressurizing is also incentivizing, because you see that there's a market for safer alternatives, and if there's a market, there is money to win from it. And you can see also from a regulatory standpoint, you're getting squeezed from regulation as well. Loss of market means loss of income, so loss of revenue, and the more revenue, there's also always a tipping point when you're changing from an old system to a new system. One of the chemical producers we've been in talk with for quite some time, they say that, like, okay, they are not really actively pushing for the alternatives unless they reach the tipping point, because they always have the main alternative, which is the main sale. But then when they see that it has shrunk too much and the other one is coming strongly, then they do the other way around. Then they push for the alternative. And okay, if someone specifically asks for the old stuff, they can still provide it, but they don't really market it actively. So there's such a big difference from company to company in which way they're working. Some are really actively pushing out. They have ambition to phase out hazardous chemicals before regulation, before customer even realize it's there. So you have so many different ways of working depending on what kind of company you are. If you're a huge chemical producer, or if you're more small one, if you're a niched one, or if you're a general one. So it's not really possible to say one way, this is how it's working. But all these ways, they work together in the same direction.
And I think in Massachusetts, we have a lot of companies that are part of more industrial supply chains. So they're not necessarily consumer products. So that pressure isn't coming from consumers as much as, so, you know, in my group, you have somebody working on aerospace and defense and somebody making building product materials that go into products down the line and stuff. So it's, you know, we don't necessarily have a consumer product business as much as we probably have industrial products at the end. And I guess that would, same
of
thing.
course, if you're talking about like aerospace and things like that, and also medical devices where you have a very, very long approval process to get something new in place, that's a different story, because then you can have a verification process of like 5 or 10 years before you have, if you're talking about a component in an engine or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's a very different story. But also downstream users, like users of chemical, even though they are not producing consumer articles or products, that's also, they could very well be interested in having a safer working environment. Because if you are working with more benign chemicals, you can reduce ventilation, for example. You can reduce a number of the security measures which are there to prevent occupational health issues. So there are many things to win, but it's all depending on where you are and who you are.
Yeah. Daryl, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you. Kind of along the line that you've been talking of, when you're looking at investors are looking into the sustainability and what these companies are doing, are they taking a hard look at what policies and procedures or actions that are implemented by the R&D groups in order to do that? Because in my experience is we have a hard time getting the R&D groups to also understand to look for the better alternatives, because they're looking for the best thing to do, the next innovation. So I was wondering if there's any kind of tools that they're looking at or some sort of evaluation they're doing on that can help influence an organization's R&D group to look for better.
So I come out, I'm not a chemist, but can you please explain that again to me? What the difference was between the way the R&D groups could operate?
So the R&D group, they're looking, how can I make this device work better, or make a better, newer option for my customer? But some of the chemistries, you know, a lot of the chemistries that they're looking at to try are pretty nasty. And we do an evaluation, we do look to guide them, but the pressure isn't on them to pick the best environmentally safe chemistry, but to make the best product. And if that has a nastier chemistry, but a lot of revenue, then they're influenced to go that way. And I think it's a matter of changing their thinking. But if your R&D organization who is leading those next steps for your organization that's not one of their main focuses, how do you influence that? It is the investors, when they're looking at it, looking at what the R&D group is doing on a sustainability level.
It's a very interesting point. So the third ask that I mentioned there, that the investors have now, which is developing safer alternatives, that's new for this upcoming year. So they just, you know, and it takes a lot of time to run one of these asks through all these giant financial institutions. So they're very, you know, very grounded in the financial institutions at the moment. So I think this will be a discussion that in a year I will be able to give you a better answer of, because they will have very in-depth conversations about these very topics this coming year. But yeah, again, maybe Jerker have a more of an understanding of how things are now.
That's certainly something that we recognize as an issue, are in terms of PFAS, for example, that if someone's developing a new product and they're already incorporating fluorinated chemistry into it, then we're talking another 20 years down the road before, that might get addressed. So that getting in on the design for the environment, as Daryl mentioned, is certainly an important thing to be evaluating. What about one of the other groups? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just one of the questions we have in ChemScore. I don't know, Jerker, if you remember, but is that we ask all the companies if they design out illicit substances of very high concern in new products, right? So but there aren't that many. That is it just 2 or 3, or how many have committed to that?
Yeah, we have 2 different asks. One to phase out the hazardous chemicals that you have in production, and one is to have a R&D ban on substances of very concern, for example. I have to go to the data sheet to see exactly how many we have who answered yes on that one. Just give me a few seconds.
So this is part of the ChemScore ranking, the survey that was sent out to all the chemical companies.
Right. While he's looking for that, another group should be ready to kind of pose whatever question you might have come up with. So get ready with your hands.
Yeah, we have a company has a public strategy with time phase-out plans for existing hazardous chemicals beyond regulatory compliance. That is what we're asking for, and it's 2 companies. They have a time strategy, and 3 more companies. They have a strategy to phase them out, but without the date. So 5 out of 50 have some kind of a strategy to phase out.
There's room for improvement.
Room for improvement, for sure.
Jill, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Well, this is actually a follow-up question to your note, Liz, that Turi recognizes that designing for the environment for the future is an issue. And I'm wondering if there is a method at Turi to reach out to smaller companies who are not yet required to report, so they're not yet in that TUR planning cycle. I've seen small companies who they weren't using harmful chemicals, but they were using lots of water, and but they weren't required to report, so they weren't really tracking it, and they were rapidly moving from that R&D phase to a much larger industrial scale. And then all of a sudden, like their wastewater situation was like completely out of hand. So I'm just wondering if Turi is developing tools to help those smaller companies get on top of that situation, both with safer chemicals and water and energy use, before they get to that point where it's a big regulatory headache.
Yeah, I will say one thing. I'm going to ask other folks at Turi and OTA to chime in, but I think, there are certain chemicals. Right now, things like TCE, we're trying to use whatever data sources we have available, like tier 2 or whatever, to find all the users, not just the ones that have tripped our threshold. But we don't do that on every chemistry or every, industry sector. But it's a really good point. And anyone from Turi want to comment or OTA about how we go after and try to head them off at the pass, so to speak?
I think one thing, because the biggest problem often in smaller companies is they don't know what they're having, and it's impossible to give advice to someone. Say, should I choose the product A, product B? And then if you ask them what's in them, I don't know. Then and that is where transparency kicks in. If they don't know what's in the products that they are buying, or in could be formulations or finished products that they're buying, they're using, and they're reselling or formulating, they need to know what's in it. And not just a safety data sheet. For example, PFAS, won't show up on a safety data sheet in most instances
Hmm.
because it's not required.
Right.
And that, okay, how should I know it? Because you have to have a communication with your suppliers and you have to trust your suppliers. If you can't trust your suppliers, either you have to just live with it or you find a supplier that can offer you transparency.
Yeah.
So that's really the case, because without transparency, you can't do anything because you don't know.
Yeah, well, I will tell you that Massachusetts and the Tura program are trying to help companies do that, and it's a mighty, task to try to get everybody to do just that. We only have like a minute left, so I want all the groups that had a question or had something in particular that you discussed in your section to go ahead and put that in the chat, and maybe we have time for one more question to be posed to our speakers. Anyone have anything in particular, or you just want to spend your minute kind of putting things in?
This is Alexis. One person from our group actually mentioned a really interesting question about tracking of like PFAS and things like that going forward. General question, and it's more of a general question. I think it was over the coming years, because there's going to be such a focus on PFAS and things like that going forward. One of the general questions, and this is not one that I think anybody necessarily needs to chime in or answer on, but is just a general inquiry, is there, when we're looking at PFAS for reporting, since we don't have a lot of information on SDSs and everything like that, but as things come out with information about PFAS, are we going to see a huge jump in PFAS reporting, or are we going to see like a diminish or a more accurate PFAS reporting as more information comes out and things get phased out? So we're kind of saying like right now we might be estimating PFAS reporting and it might be very high, but that's just because we don't have great PFAS information. And then as SDS information and things like that come out that have more accurate information, the reporting will go down. Or is it just going to be phased out, and by the time the SDSs catch up to having PFAS on it, is it all going to be gone and eliminated from the chemicals? So it's going to be an interesting way to see how to report that going forward, and documentation and transparency and things like that is going to be part of it. So
it will, and we don't know the answer to your question. We're guessing there are going to be more folks reporting as they get that information, but you're right, some people may be being conservative now and find out they don't have as much of it. One quick question, if anyone has time to stay, is have you had insurance companies requesting PFAS information? If you have, please drop that in the chat, because that would be really interesting. I want to make sure before we run out of time here that we thank our speakers. This was really interesting, and the kind of pressure you're talking about at the top of the supply chain or anywhere down the supply chain is really important to our TUR planners, to being able to make the case to the company that this is important and that they need to be focused on it and need to invest in it. So just want to give a virtual round of applause for our speakers. It was really, really great. And again, if anyone has anything super that came out of your breakout group, please feel free to share that before you sign off. Thank you to all of you. And if anyone has anything to share, we can stay on a minute, but I think our time is up. And then again, this afternoon, we're going to be having another session. So if you haven't already signed up for that, you may still register for it. And you're going to get a great demo and some super information about how you can get rid of TCE if you happen to still be using it. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jirka and Patrick. That was really great. And